think it's safe to say Trails to Azure is mostly aiming to prioritize its story and has mostly benefited from it. I think its combat, however, is mostly geared toward progressing the storyline. This prioritization has resulted in the combat's deterioration. This more so applies to the underutilization of offensive arts that apply effects to the enemy, not arts that buff and enemies are weak to, since those are the only moves that can do such thing. This criticism is mostly aimed towards regular encounters, as I would appreciate it more if encounters were more engaging. I've heard from other people that they think this pushes you to carefully plan which spells or arts you will use. I don't mean to be an ass, but this isn't a game that is usually extremely difficult and punishing with turns. That makes you think how much you have to plan. Throughout the game, I almost always use an increase in defense, strength, speed, and AoE for buffs. Rarely did I ever have to change any of these things, and try to approach the combat differently. In other words, difficult fight, use these things to get through it. Of course, you do have to use arts, but I don't think selecting an enemy weakness is exactly difficult. I would have liked for different weapons to apply different effects that would actually change the game, or individual arts having their effects actually be useful or be a game changer, instead of using that turn to spam the same art or melee over and over. Buddy, the poison on your weapon isn't the secret strategy to beating that HP sponge. To further my point on basic attacks, in the beginning they are a bit too reliable as the only way to end enemies. Add the less enemy HP, and in most fights I was spamming melee until the fight ended before I got to see any of the enemy's unique movesets. Later on in the game, this tends to stream in the opposite direction. Enemies now are HP sponges. As I said in my impressions video, planned encounters would be a fantastic addition. Being able to balance the encounters, knowing how many fights the player is engaged in, allows you to set difficulty better, which means add many mechanics, which can also push the players to experiment more with different setups. I mean, what happened to movement, baby? Maybe a fight where the enemy weak to melee stunts your ability to move as much. Maybe they drop some slow terrain on the ground. Maybe you directly have to be facing them to damage them as they constantly turn. I mean, enemies rarely use directional arts now. The quote-unquote other common bosses or mini-bosses that you'd go against early are cryptids or mutated monsters. These are smaller bosses, but are a noticeable inclusion which I found to be bland, as they are very similar. One near the end, which tries to combine many mechanics, has a spin move with knockback, a channeling directional attack which can stun you, and that's it. It wouldn't bother me if it could have had maybe some less HP, it just feels padded to evoke some grandeur right now. Talking about padding, most combat encounters are paced nicely. As I said earlier, it tries to focus on the story more, that is, until later parts of the game, specifically the last chapter, with the pattern of get in the fight, join up with a new member, or progress the story a tiny bit in exchange for hours of combat. In other words, having to face the same enemies over and over everywhere, for example when climbing the orbital tower, going against the 3 knights that serve under the Society's Knight, Iron Rod, I think that's how you pronounce it, visiting the Azure tree, and having to beat every single boss in it. They are still very lengthy encounters which just end up being many HP sponges that hit hard, and if they aren't that, you can just spam their weakness arts and melee with none of them having any other entertaining mechanics. But Lou, how is this different from games in general, having you fight many of the same enemies? Sure, 1. They are engaging. 2. The combat is actively fun and doesn't progress just spamming guard and the same buffs. 3. They aren't extremely tedious. 4. They aren't drip feeding the story after establishing themselves as a mostly story game. 5. You can skip them as most of it isn't a numbers game. Combat criticisms, of course, also affect bosses, especially the human ones. I think this example represents most bosses. Arios has 2 enemies besides him in the last chapter, does the same moves, and is beat by spamming melee attacks. This is similar to almost all of the late game bosses. Simple mechanics, too much HP, and repetitive. Some bosses of these include Arian Rod, Shirley, Arios, Sigmund, Campanella, the 3 knights just to name most. I mean, most of the bosses the game considers to be boss-worthy. Except one, which is Mariabelle. This boss fight is actually pretty good. Movement only across the lines, constantly spawning enemies in the way, debuffs being thrown out, swapping between places. Though I still think you can spam her down easily, this is the best boss fight in the game, which is unfortunately saying much. As for the last boss that I have to mention, he is the same as the rest of the flawed enemies I mentioned before, except he spawns enemies that have an immunity for a certain amount of hits and can instantly wipe your team with his channeling art. If that's not good design, I don't know what is. In conclusion, Trails to Azure's combat is worse tactically than Zero, worse paced than Zero, inhabits Trails in the Sky's fault with being obsessed with Guard, and is unengaging. Azure's story and characters are especially focused on in this game for the most part, though that doesn't mean it doesn't come with its own issues. Trails' story starts off pretty slow, which can bring context into how the SSS's job is still very grounded, as in doing fetch quests for some time. I did have a problem with this since I think it went on for too long, and I feel like the prequel's ending could have done a better job if they were so inclined. Azure's first step forward is an upcoming meeting in a tower, which was built to be the place for people to unite and trade. The leader of Erebonia and President Calvary make a plan to hire two Jaeger groups, Hayu and the Red Constellations, catch the terrorists planning to attack them to support their stance on them being able to put their own soldiers on Crossbell State, as the show Crossbell can't handle itself on its own. What's good about the storyline is the talk on politics, built from the last game since your city had organizations like the Mafia tied to the officials of the Empire. But what's truly great about it is how though the Hayu captures the terrorists, the Red Constellations were tasked to exterminate the terrorists in cold blood, which Trails almost never displays in its past games. In which this point on, the Constellations establish themselves as killers while at the same time trying to invite Randy back to their team, which is because Randy's father, the leader of the Red Constellations, recently passed at war with another faction. His uncle and cousin Shirley take charge, which causes him to suddenly leave the group, until the SSS save him and he realizes that it's okay to share your struggle and not have to act like a tough guy all the time. Though I really do find it odd that he shares his story of literally murdering people and using an innocent village to bait the enemy, and then they forgive him. Lloyd pines over the practical Hitler of the world when he died in the last game, and you're telling me this guy goes Rambo and you forgive him in a snap because you're friends with him? This also happens to Rixia's arc, being undercover as the Assassin Yin from the last game. She tries to reject her family's assassin path and focus her passion on dancing in the Arc-en-Ciel. Yeah, wow, I'm glad she's not the cold-blooded killer she thinks she is. This is the trouble I have with Trails to Azure's sometimes morality. I find it really odd that Lloyd is stuck up on enforcing principles and then he breaks them in his friend group. Anyways, though Azure doesn't always have these focused stories, instead allows you to spend time with each of the characters in fun events, such as the festival, the beach, playing volleyball, or on a short vacation. It's nice to have quality time with your team besides dialogue in between scenes. After this, Shirley attacks Arc-en-Ciel and kills Ilya, the most famous dancer, and overtakes the entire city in a raid. This turn for a darker story, including death, I think helps convey the actual terror in the story, which I love and I hoped from in the past games. Especially since we spend so much time with Ilya, and she's such an amazing character, and she is actually alive. A few days later, Dieter Cross is finally elected president for Crossbell, along with electing Arios, the top fighter Abrasher, around to join the new force. After grouping up with Lecter and getting a call from him, Lloyd puts the pieces together on how Dieter Cross framed the Empire and called the Constellations raid and help from Ouroboros on his own city. You find out that Kia has been taken to Michelin, the girl you saved from last game that is said to be a god while being trapped in a capsule to preserve her life for thousands of years, right? I really hope I didn't have to explain that, since I hope you guys knew that since this is a sequel. After finding Kia, she's surrounded by Arios and Maribel, the daughter of Dieter Croix. Basically, the Croix family inherited one of the 7 treasures, or Septerions, given down to humans, but they lost it and spent hundreds of years building a formula to retrieve it. I know this might seem as way too subjective, but I'm not really that appreciative of the plot twist. Maybe if we had more mention of it beforehand, like moments diving into how civilians started to blame the Empire for their doings. I only remember this being said once, actually, through a newspaper text. I would have liked more of having to visit lost families and watch them turn hateful. I would have especially liked some foreshadowing of Maribel, and intrusive thoughts, but why is she wearing that? Why does she have to look like Dracula with her collar flaying out? Anyways, Arios blocks the SSS from interrupting, and their magic formula, using the orbital network, expands through Crossbell, turning Kia into the Treasure of Zero, which she then gives powers to 3 tributes, or ions, that are now autonomous, and destroy the enemy's forces. What strikes me as odd here is the sadness about what happened to Kia. Even though it's not really explained right away, I was just very confused what was the big deal. What's the urgency? She just looks like a floating blue ghost to me. Anyways, Noelle then backstabs the SSS and jails them separately. And a pretty bare bones prison escape. I mean, really? We get rescued by Zeit, the dog that joined you from last game, which is revealed to be one of the guardians of the 7 treasures, or Septerions. And while Zeit drops us off, we get a reveal that Wazy was a church mole, like Kevin. We then join forces to deal with Kia, which has become the Septerion of Zero, possessing the powers of time and space of the Demiurgos, which was the Septerion of Mirage, which disappeared. As a side note, I also don't like characters that have moments of trying too hard to sound tough. If you touch Kia, I will destroy you. Dude, you are asking them for help, and they're helping you, and they've been helping you. The reveal for Wazy, though foreshadowed a tiny bit through his gang name being Testaments, made me realize how little writing he truly gets, and a lot of the other members get, even though he's now a main character. Anyways, you get on their ship traversing through Crossbell. All of this while there are rebellion groups and citizens rioting because of the corrupt way Crossbell is being ruled. We also get cutscenes of Joshua, Estelle, and Ren fighting against Crossbell as well. While this happens, you're trying to regroup your team, making an alliance with Hayu and Rixia, finding Randy, winning back Noelle, rescuing Elle, and the mayor to try and allow him to talk about the corruption to rally citizens. Turning off the city barriers by stopping the bells ringing by fighting off members of the Ouroboros, and joining up with Lecter of the Empire, and Kilika of Calvard. All of this is to finally group up and rush the Orbital Tower. Unfortunately, the story gets worse, as when meeting the White Ion, with Croix on top of the building, mysteriously his machine turns off. It is revealed that his daughter betrayed him by signing a contract behind his back with the Ouroboros. And it is revealed that the man behind it all was Mr. Grimwood, the town's lawyer that we have seen from the last game, or maybe one scene in Azure, along with a tree spawning up from the ground, which is said to be Kia. Not only is this the millionth twist with barely any foreshadowing, the only explanation is, it must make sense, he is involved with law and politics like you. What does this change? What is the point of this? Really? What's my motivation here? I don't even know what's bad about her being a floating treasure, now making me not worry for her or care. Now she turns into a tree. Oh, I'm sorry, her body technically isn't? Cheryl's trying to drum up interest in bullshit twists is not landing well for me, and then covering it back to make sure she's actually not dead, guys. Relax, we don't do this in the game. Azure's pacing is pretty bad right now, through the extremely prolonged joining of members. The final mission is extremely long and tedious. When you arrive at the Azure tree, you have to go through levels and fight an enemy, or a villain that's been appearing in the game that you haven't fought yet. This unlocks a seal a bunch of times that acts as padding besides the fight with Arios, in which he explains how he didn't kill Guy, but Mr. Grimwood. There is so much mind-numbing combat with no story in this chunk of game. Now this is the worst thing ever. Interestingly enough, you realize the plan all along was to utilize Kia's ability to manipulate space and time and perception to change the world events, and how Kia has already done this in the last game where you fought Joaquim and died. Using this tree allows you to connect to the world, in which after turning Grimwood to the other side by telling him how people won't be able to grow and people's losses from before will be for nothing, Mariabelle then kills him and makes you fight her. Never mind, looks like she didn't kill him because we don't do that here.
That's crazy.
Joe, that's been your answer every time I tell a story. It's like you're not even listening.
You are also revealed that Kia has an ability to manipulate people unconsciously into loving her. And this reveal makes her lose control and become the Azure Demiurgos. She then tries to erase herself like the original Septerion of Mirage did. But Lloyd jumps in and you enter a different plane and convince her to give up on her powers and join you. Now is for the rant time. Not only does this game pull out of its ass how it didn't kill Grimwood, I find it funny how easy it is to change his mind, basically destroying everything, then going, oh yeah, you're right, man. Anyways, it mentions how it's putting all responsibility and restricting Kia's freedom. Yes, restricting a girl's freedom that you know for over half a year is worth the dozens of deaths and destruction that will happen. Believe it or not, it wasn't even an issue on his emotions toward her. The crew talks about if this is just and if this is right. If you truly believe this, you would ask for Kia to return when you were dead. And this situation doesn't even work anyways. You are changing the world itself. That means this is the way things are. You are in the real world, not trapped in some cryogenic chamber living an actual life like in Persona 5 or something. That is not just, and we should get together as people to fight for what's wrong. we would never grow as people? Guess what, jackass? The man in that orange jacket, right there. He didn't let people grow at all. He basically killed an entire village filled with people to bait an enemy. What's wrong with relying on something? Let's not give the kids any drop of water when they're dying in the streets because I don't want them to rely on us. Then he enters a plane. What even is this place? To give her powers up and come back with him? Wonderful. Nothing happens at all. No stakes. Very nice, guys. Very nice story. In conclusion, Trails to Azure's combat is worse than its predecessor and relies on bad design from the Trails in the Sky series, and has a story that loses its attention, breaks its pacing, drip-feeding story, less individual character moments, non-existent stakes, and insulting the audience and how much they have to suspend their disbelief. With that being said, Trails to Azure is the second worst Trails game behind Trails in the Sky third. And if you were entertained by this video, subscribe, comment, and like because I'll have more coming and it keeps me pushing.